Okay, let's just dive right into this explainer. Today we're unpacking a truly mind-blowing hypothesis from Dr. Serkan Zorba's book, Jinn and the Forbidden Tree. I mean, what if the absolute oldest, most universally recognized story ever told isn't just, a moral fable? What if it's actually a masterclass in ancient microbiology? We are literally bridging the gap between ancient scripture and modern science today.
So the core question we're looking at is pretty profound. What if the story of the Forbidden Tree is actually a scientifically accurate allegory for the origins of complex life? It's a super unconventional claim for sure. Zorba basically posits that ancient mythology, specifically the creation narratives found in Abrahamic traditions, actually encodes the deep biological history of our planet. It asks us to look at these sacred texts through the lens of a biochemist, which is just fascinating. We've all seen traditional religious art depicting Adam, Eve, and the serpent at the tree, right? But Zorba points out these bizarre, unexplained details in this universal story that usually just get completely glossed over by traditional interpretations. I mean, really think about it. Why a tree? Why this sudden kind of shameful manifestation of nakedness after eating from it? And why on earth are they commanded to go forth and become enemies? To answer that, we basically have to change our entire sense of scale.
Section 1. Adam as early life, a biological archetype.
According to this hypothesis, Adam isn't the first human being at all. Instead, Adam represents the mysterious origin and early stages of literally all life on Earth. And the Garden of Eden? Well, instead of a literal paradise with rivers and fruit trees, Zorba maps this to an early biological golden age. We're talking roughly 4 billion years ago. This was an era where early single-celled life lived totally cooperatively. And crucially, it was a completely anaerobic environment, meaning a world with absolutely zero oxygen. Life was just this communal, non-competitive enterprise.
Section 2. The tree is water, the ultimate metaphor. Now, traditional interpretations usually picture an apple, a fig, or maybe a wheat stalk. But Zorba argues that the forbidden tree isn't a plant at all. It's actually the ubiquitous, life-sustaining water molecule. Because water has two constituents, hydrogen and oxygen, the allegory strictly forbids approaching it. And why is that? Well, because splitting this specific molecule would unleash massive, completely irreversible biogeochemical consequences on a global scale. So, eating from the tree actually represents a momentous, singular event in Earth's history: oxygenic photosynthesis. This was a unique biological hack by ancient proto-cyanobacteria to split that forbidden water molecule. They essentially wanted to capture the hydrogen to use as energy, but in doing so, they released molecular oxygen as a byproduct in massive amounts into that pristine anaerobic environment. It's a huge irony, really. The very oxygen that eventually sustains complex life, and ultimately human beings, was initially incredibly toxic to the life forms of that era. This hack triggered an absolute biological catastrophe roughly 2.5 billion years ago. Geochemists actually call this the Great Oxidation Event, or the oxygen catastrophe. Aside from the actual origin of life itself, it's considered the single most fundamental transformation in Earth's entire history.
Watching this build chronologically really puts it into perspective. 4 billion years ago, we have that anaerobic communal life, the garden. Then, around 3.5 billion years ago, those proto-cyanobacteria invent oxygenic photosynthesis, tasting the tree. By 2.5 billion years ago, the Great Oxidation Event just completely wrecks the old anaerobic world, flooding the Earth with oxygen and forcing life to either rapidly adapt or die. And then much later, about 300 million years ago, oxygen levels peak, enabling massive animal body sizes that paves the way for complex multicellular life.
Section 3. Nakedness and enemies, the biological fallout. The story tells us that upon eating from the tree, their nakedness became manifest to them. Zorba argues that this nakedness refers directly to the life-threatening vulnerability of cellular DNA. The sudden influx of reactive oxygen species, which are basically highly destructive, energized oxygen molecules, was intensely toxic. The genetic material of these early microbes was essentially exposed, totally naked, and under severe attack from this poisonous new gas. To survive this toxic oxygen crisis, these naked microbes had to adapt fast. First, they enclosed their DNA inside a protective nucleus, forming the eukaryotic cell. Zorba points out that this beautifully mirrors the metaphor of sewing leaves together to cover private parts. And even more astonishingly, the intense pressure to efficiently repair oxygen-damaged DNA actually drove the evolution of meiosis,
which resulted in the emergence of biological sex and gender. This exact scientific consensus is perfectly summarized by biochemist Nick Lane, who says, oxygen is central not just to aging and death, but also through the deepest of connections to sex and the emergence of gender. So if you think about it, the biblical emergence of gender and mortality was actually a direct evolutionary response to coping with toxic oxygen. Mind-blowing, right?
Furthermore, the allegories decree that they must leave the garden and go forth as enemies to one another perfectly describes the dark end of that peaceful, communal microbial golden age we talked about earlier. So why did they become enemies? Well, it comes down to a specific number, 40%. Oxygen-powered aerobic respiration is about 40% more efficient at extracting energy than the older anaerobic methods. This massive leap in available energy fundamentally changed the rules of the game for life on Earth. Because of those massive energy yields, carnivorous food chains suddenly became totally viable. The emergence of predation was born. Life turned into this fierce struggle of tooth and claw, with organisms actively hunting and eating each other just to survive. It is quite literally the reason our modern natural world functions the way it does today, and it perfectly matches the divine decree to live his enemies on Earth. And as a super fascinating side note, high atmospheric oxygen even enabled the massive collagen synthesis needed for gigantic animals, like the sauropod dinosaurs. Zorba actually correlates this peak in atmospheric oxygen and the resulting gigantic body sizes to the ancient biblical myths of giants, or the Nephilim, walking the earth. Section 4, The 5 Keys Decoded, Myth Meets Biology.
So let's tie this all together, because these crucial points decode the myth pretty effortlessly. This tree maps perfectly to the water molecule. Eating the tree is the act of oxygenic photosynthesis by those protocyanobacteria. The sudden appearance of nakedness maps to the vulnerability of DNA and the emergence of biological sex as a repair mechanism against oxidative stress. Sowing leaves describes the enclosure of genetic material within the eukaryotic cell. And finally, becoming enemies to one another represents the emergence of predation, which happened entirely due to the powerful new energetics of oxygen. It all leads up to that stark, poetic decree found in the texts, "Therein shall ye live, and therein shall ye die." As Zorba notes, oxygen is basically the ultimate paradox of our existence. It's the very trigger that allowed for complex, multicellular life, and eventually us human beings, giving us the energy to live. But it's also a highly reactive poison that eventually causes cellular degradation, aging, and ultimately death. Which leaves us with a truly profound mystery to ponder as we wrap up. Did our ancestors somehow intuitively encode the biological timeline of our planet into our most sacred mythologies? Could these ancient revelations have actually communicated the deep biological history of Earth way, way before modern science had the tools to discover it? It's a staggering perspective that completely reimagines the relationship between ancient wisdom and modern biology. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this incredibly unique hypothesis changes the way you look at the oldest story ever told. Keep questioning and keep learning.